Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm Valerie Amos. I'm the Master of University College, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all here for this evening's HLA Hart Lecture. This is an annual event for us here at Univ, and I'm particularly pleased to be able to welcome members of the Hart family who are with us this evening. I'd also like to thank Ray Feldman and Lord Mance, who unfortunately cannot be with us this evening, for their ongoing support. I'm also delighted that Professor Danielle Allen of Harvard University is delivering tonight's lecture. Her work focuses on the interface between classics, history, and political science, and I can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Professor Allen will be introduced by Professor Ruth Chang, in a moment. But we really can't have an HLA Hart lecture without me saying a little bit about the great man. He was born in Harrogate and did his undergraduate degree here in Oxford in classical greats at New College. Unfortunately, not here at Univ, but we did capture him later. He went on to become a barrister and practiced in London. And during World War II, he worked with MI5, which must have been really, really interesting. And after the war, he entered academia, first at New College and then here at Univ, when he was elected Professor of Jurisprudence in 1952. And we were very lucky to have him here at Univ as a fellow for many, many years. Subsequently, he became the principal of Brasenose College. And his work, as many of you know, crosses that interface between law and philosophy. A really important work that is still of such relevance today. I'd like to introduce our own Professor Ruth Chang, who has done so much to reinvigorate the HLA Hart Memorial Lecture. Ruth, a huge thank you. Ruth is the Professor of Jurisprudence here at Univ, and Ruth will introduce Professor Allen. Thank you all again for being with us this evening. Ruth.
Thanks, Valerie, and welcome, everyone. For the special 40th anniversary of the Hart Lectures, I wanted to make a special shout-out to Charlie and Adam Hart, the sons of H.L.A. Hart, who have been unfailing supporters of this lecture series. And we're also happy to have with us the very distinguished Nicola Lacey, who's a renowned professor of law at the LSE, the Hart Lecture of 2015, and the author of the definitive biography of H.L.A. Hart entitled A Life of H.L.A. Hart, The Nightmare and the Noble Dream. Both Nicola and the Hart family have been stalwarts of these Hart Lectures, and we want to thank them for their unwavering support. Now, it's a great privilege, really, an honor to introduce Danielle Allen, one of the most original and interesting democratic theorists and public intellectuals working today. Danielle is the James Bryant Conant University Professor at Harvard University, where her work spans political philosophy, classics, ethics, public policy, and democratic reform. She has 2 PhDs, one in classics from Cambridge and another in government from Harvard. She started her career at the University of Chicago, where she was the Dean of Humanities and started a poetry series. Yes, she's also an expert in 20th century poetry. She directs the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation and the Democratic Knowledge Project, initiatives devoted to civic education and institutional renewal. She received the prestigious Kluge Prize from the Library of Congress in 2020 for, quote, internationally recognized scholarship and political theory, and her commitment to improving democratic practice and civics education, close quote. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. She has chaired many boards, including the Pulitzer Prize and the Mellon Foundation. She was a regular columnist for the Washington Post for many years, but, I'm allowed to say this, resigned when Jeff Bezos directed the Post not to endorse any U.S. presidential candidate, breaking with a practice and tradition of almost 50 years of the newspapers making such an endorsement. So instead, today Danielle creates and is the subject of meaty, topical podcasts. I just listened to one the other day she did about the Iran war, and she extracts weighty insights from the people she brilliantly interviews, and she always brilliantly insightful herself when she's the one fielding questions. I really recommend looking her up. Danielle's scholarship is remarkable for combining rigorous classical learning with urgent contemporary relevance. She has consistently explored how democratic societies sustain trust, equality, and civic agency under conditions of deep pluralism. Her early landmark work, Talking to Strangers, Anxieties of Citizenship Since Brown v. Board of Education, examined the fragility of civic trust in racially divided democracies. The MacArthur Foundation cited this book when it awarded her a Genius Grant in 2001 and praised her for, quote, uniting the classicist's careful attention to text and language with the political theorist's sophisticated and informed engagement, close quote. She was just 29. Her later work, Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of the Independence in Defense of Equality, offered a striking reinterpretation of the American founding text as fundamentally committed to political equality. The Society of American Historians awarded it the Francis Parkman Prize, praising it as, quote, a book of learned ideas conveyed in luminous prose with a sure arc and glistening with vividness, clarity, empathy, narrative power, and explanatory force. The New York Review of Books called it a tour de force. It became one of the most widely discussed works of democratic theory of the last decade. Danielle's intellectual range is extraordinary. In Cuz, The Life and Times of Michael A., she turned to memoir and social criticism, reflecting on the incarceration and death of her cousin in order to illuminate the human consequences of mass incarceration in America. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Danielle emerged as one of the most important public voices thinking about democracy under conditions of crisis. Her book, Democracy in the Time of Coronavirus, was described by the University of Chicago Press as, quote, both an invaluable playbook for meeting our current moment and a stirring reflection on the future of democracy itself, close quote. In that work, Danielle argued that democratic resilience depends not merely on institutions, but on solidarity, civic trust, and the capacity of citizens to act together across difference. More recently, in 2023, she published Justice by Means of Democracy, where she argues for what she calls power-sharing liberalism, a vision of democracy that places political participation and shared civic power at the center of justice itself. Ezra Klein at the New York Times called it, quote, a sweeping vision. Josiah Ober called it compelling and superb, and Margaret Levi lauded it as, quote, without a doubt, one of the most important books ever written on democracy. If you're interested in learning more about the arguments and ideas behind power-sharing liberalism, come along to the old library at All Souls College, right across the street, tomorrow at 5 p.m., when we'll be discussing some of its main ideas under the auspices of the interdisciplinary program Philosophy, Law, and Politics, and our own Joe Wolf. Where'd you go, Joe? There you go. We'll be opening the discussion, and everyone's welcome. Now, a recurring theme throughout Danielle's work is the idea that democracy is not simply a system of government, but a shared practice of world building. That commitment to civic agency, to the idea that ordinary citizens must be equipped to participate meaningfully in collective self-government, animates everything she writes. Danielle tells me that her curiosity about the historical roots of representation have been simmering on her mental back burner for the last 10 years. That curiosity is now coming to fruition in a new book, Radical Duke, actually arriving in June, but here's the one copy that exists. And we'll be getting a taste of that story that she tells in the book today. So in today's lecture, Danielle uncovers the story of how the late 18th century, the radical Duke, Charles Lennox, the third Duke of Richmond, developed a proposal for representation that has been a hidden part of British constitutional history and the history of theory and practice of representation. As Danielle will reveal, this untold history has something to teach us about representation in the modern age. And we are delighted to have with us today the present 11th Duke and Duchess of Richmond, Charles Gordon Lennox and Janet Elizabeth Gordon Lennox. Also, we've got with us Dr. Clementine de la Poer Beresford, who is a writer and curator of the Goodwood Collection at the Goodwood House, and Dr. Rosemary Baird, the former curator of the Goodwood Collection, where Danielle uncovered some of the exciting discoveries she'll be sharing with us today. Now, for those of you interested in Danielle's next project, she is working on something of breathtaking importance and ambition, mostly, namely, to introduce artificial intelligence in a wise and value-driven and democratic way to the operations of power in both local and state Massachusetts government. Her work will no doubt become a model for other states and municipalities across the country, and maybe even here in Britain. I want to end, thank God I'm finally finished. I want to end with the following thought. At a moment when democracies across the world face crises of legitimacy, polarization, inequality, and distrust, Danielle Allen is an essential voice asking not only how democracy survives, but how it might genuinely flourish. We need her. Please join me in welcoming Danielle Allen as the 40th HLA Hart Memorial Lecturer to talk to us about the Radical Duke, universal suffrage, and the modernization of constitutional monarchy. Thank you.
I want to say thank you to Professor Chang for that exceptionally generous introduction. Thank you, Baroness Amos, as well, for the warm hospitality you've shown me here. It is an extremely daunting thing to give a lecture in a chapel, which is gorgeous. Also, to give a lecture for the H.L.A. Hart Memorial Lecture in front of the Hart family, and to give a lecture about the third Duke of Richmond in front of the current Duke and Duchess of Richmond. So you will forgive me for all things, because nothing could be as daunting as all of that. And my father is watching on live stream to boot. All right. So it really is a pleasure and honor to have the opportunity to give the 40th H.L.A. Hart Memorial Lecture. I can't pretend to be a scholar of jurisprudence, but I am a scholar of constitutional theory, and intersections between the two domains are many. It's thrilling to have the chance to introduce to you today a fascinating, largely overlooked 18th century figure of great importance to constitutional thought, Charles Lennox, the third Duke of Richmond, whose seat was at Goodwood in Sussex, and who was known as the most beautiful man in Britain. On June 3rd, 1780, in the House of Lords, the Duke introduced the first bill for universal manhood suffrage at a national scale in modern history. He appears to have owned a beautiful and large ceremonial scale parchment of the Declaration of Independence, one of only 2 such parchments in existence. He was also the first political patron of Thomas Paine, most famous as the author of Common Sense, the pamphlet published in 1776 in Philadelphia, arguing that the Americans should overthrow monarchy. From 1768 to 74, before going to America, Paine had used a cover as an excise officer in Lewis, working within the jurisdiction of the Duke of Richmond, to serve as an amanuensis for the Duke for some of the most scandalous newspaper essays of the age, the Junius essays. And so there's a volume of the Junius essays, but also on the right, Paine's first book, The Juryman's Touchstone, published in 1771, which hasn't been previously known to be among his works, with an inscription you can barely see on the left-hand side of that, to the Duke of Richmond, thanking him for his support. So feel free to ask more questions about that when we get to the question part. So not for nothing, these associations with Paine, with the Americans, not for nothing has Richmond been called the Radical Duke. Before I tell you more about him, though, and make the case for the significance of his contributions to modern British constitutional monarchy, let me give you some of the broader context that explains his importance and appropriateness as the subject for this Hart Memorial Lecture. H.L.A. Hart, who became Professor of Jurisprudence here at Oxford in 1952, famously offered a positivist account about what law is, in which the ultimate source of legal validity in any legal system is a rule of recognition, a convergent practice among officials about what counts as a source of law. In the British case, this rule of recognition points to the king in Parliament, or, as Hart put it when he published the concept of law in 1961, during the reign of Elizabeth II, the queen in Parliament. This is the idea that legislative authority resided in the monarch in Parliament jointly, not in the monarch alone. The concept of parliamentary supremacy and the sovereign in Parliament as the source of law is, of course, much older than Hart. Really, it goes back to the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89, the Bill of Rights of 1689, and the Act of Settlement of 1701. Collectively, these established the doctrine that the Crown could not legislate, suspend laws, or levy taxes without Parliament. Before 1689, the relationship between royal prerogative and statute was genuinely contested. After 1689, speaking loosely, it wasn't. Whether the doctrine could survive the age of revolution, though, without a moral foundation, or whether it required a moral foundation to be regrounded for a democratic age, is the question to which we'll return. Traditional Whig historians, like those from whom Hart took the concept of the sovereign in Parliament, viewed the Glorious Revolution as having laid a foundation for British liberalism in the rights of British subjects. As the story went, those principles thereafter unfolded, more or less continuously, in ever greater liberalization, with the reign of George III being but a brief reactionary interlude in an otherwise unbroken tale of progress. The early 20th century historian Louis Namier demolished the argument that the 18th century straightforwardly advanced a further flowering of liberal principles. He painted a portrait of a century of grubby politics, of networks, patronage, and competition for places. While more recent scholars have shown that Namier overstated his case, he was right that the direction of the British Constitution was truly up for grabs in the late 18th century. By 1776, the question of whether the doctrine of the king and Parliament as the source of law would hold was genuinely open because of pressures from empire, King George III's style of rule, and the functioning of Parliament itself. Revolution across the Atlantic and the Channel intensified those pressures. The political pamphlets of the 1760s and 1770s routinely sounded an alarm about a constitution in crisis, and they were right. During this period, the Duke of Richmond's contribution was to understand that crisis better than anyone, even the king, and to provide a blueprint for riding the ship, a constitutional architecture that revised the concept of the sovereign and Parliament to make it fit for the modern conditions that emerged during the age of revolution. That's the story I'm going to tell today. Charles Lennox, the third Duke of Richmond, was born February 11, 1735, to parents who dutifully and consistently served the Hanoverian monarchs. Succeeding to the dukedom in 1750, at the age of 15, he spent 5 years on the Grand Tour. So that's the 15-year-old for you on the Grand Tour, getting his portrait done in Italy on 2 occasions. During this time on tour, he visited with a friend of his father's, the Enlightenment philosophe Montesquieu. He also struck up an intense friendship with General James Wolfe, 8 years his senior. As another young man mentored by Wolfe said, "He made me read not only military books, but philosophy. He gave me liberal notions of every kind." Wolfe also encouraged Richmond to see the British military and administration as suffering from corruption, too much investment in patronage, too little concern for merit, an absence of respect for the dangers posed by continental adversaries. While these were the early seeds of Richmond's radicalism, they would take 2 decades to reach full flower, leading to the point where Richmond was not only the first member of Parliament to introduce universal manhood suffrage, but also the first member of the House of Lords to recommend recognizing American independence. Today, I won't tell the full story of how Richmond's radicalism developed, nor of all the forms it took. That's what my forthcoming book does, and I will say, it's a rip-roaring good story. Today, I'll just focus on how Richmond put together the pieces of a novel conception of the British constitutional order and an updated approach to the concept of the sovereign in Parliament as the only source of law. To make this case about Richmond's contributions to constitutional theory, I'll share 3 vignettes from his life. October 1765 found 30-year-old Charles Lennox, the 3rd Duke of Richmond, serving as Britain's ambassador to the court of Versailles. He's a bit younger than that here. This is actually from the 1750s, so he's about 8 or so years older than this portrait in the 1765 when he's in Paris as ambassador. He was, at this point, 5 years into a bitter feud with King George III, and in his first major post, though one beneath his abilities and ambitions. While in Paris, he was tasked with resolving lingering issues from the Franco-British 7 Years' War, disputes over fishing rights in Nova Scotia, compensation for British merchants left holding now worthless French currency, and most importantly, governance of the newly acquired Canada, in which he had a great interest, including having the governor of Canada, who had been his tutor, Governor Carleton, General Carleton, send him a moose to Goodwood so he could have it painted by George Stubbs as a part of studying anatomy. So governance of Canada involved many questions, including the anatomy of moose. At any rate, Richmond carried this work on Canada into 1766, when he briefly served as Secretary of State, responsible for parts of Europe and the American colonies. In that post, he advanced religious toleration of Canadian Catholics, the first such policy in British colonial history. At the same time, he began to consider how to link the colonies to the English government through the king, with support from local assemblies. A serious student of political philosophy, and again especially of his father's dear friend Montesquieu, Richmond was a Whig in the sense that he treasured British liberties and believed British subjects deserved to have a voice in government through a legislature acting in conjunction with the king. In the case of the Canadians, that meant religious toleration and political representation. With remarkable acuity, Richmond was sketching the principles that would later become the 1774 Quebec Act, which fully granted Canadian Catholics freedom of religion and restored French civil law in the colony. Although the act alienated many American colonists who saw the toleration of Catholicism as a betrayal of their British liberties, it also marked the emergence of the British Empire's defining strategy, governing through accommodation of local customs. Yet the Quebec Act departed sharply from Richmond's vision in one critical respect. By 1774, he was in opposition in Parliament. Lord North's government had placed Canada under the control of a governor-in-council, vesting authority in a governor and an appointed advisory body instead of an elected legislature. The governor-in-council was a clear departure from the standard of the king in Parliament. While Richmond supported the Act's toleration of Canadian Catholics, he opposed the governor-in-council arrangement, arguing that it created an executive with unchecked power. In Parliament, he rebuked the government for repeatedly invoking immediate necessity to justify such constitutional innovations and for allowing those emergency measures to become what he called an engine of oppression and tyranny. As conflict intensified in the colonies south of Canada, Richmond grew increasingly sympathetic to the colonists' claim that Parliament should not exercise legislative authority over them. As Benjamin Franklin put it succinctly, The sovereignty of the Crown I understand. The sovereignty of the British legislature outside of Britain I do not understand. While Richmond still believed that the American colonies should remain within the British Empire, he was no longer convinced that Parliament held sovereignty over them. In his view, the Americans needed their own legislatures, much as the Canadians did. They should recognize the king as their sovereign, but not Parliament as their representative body. This created a constitutional puzzle. In the 18th century, as I said in my opening remarks, sovereignty was understood to lie in the combined authority of the monarch and the legislature, the king and parliament arrangement. The crown did not act independently of parliament, and the idea that it might govern the colonies on its own did not fit within that framework. By early 1775, the parliamentary opposition broadly agreed that the American conflict had triggered a constitutional crisis. Members of the opposition were, though, deeply divided. Richmond, for his part, decried the desperate temerity of the ministry and wished that all real friends of England and of America would heartily unite to save the nation. Seeking to unify his faction, Richmond helped advance an expansive bill calling for the withdrawal of standing armies from the colonies, the restoration of trial by jury in civil cases, and most importantly, a promise not to tax subjects unless with their consent through provincial assemblies. It was a serious attempt to avert war, one that might have laid the foundation for something like the modern British Commonwealth, but the king and his ministers adamantly opposed this solution. The summer of 1775 brought one final attempt at reconciliation. At the urging of John Dickinson, the Continental Congress sent its olive branch petition directly to the king, bypassing Parliament and asking him to dismiss his cabinet and repeal the laws to which the Americans objected. The Americans had concluded that George III was the true source of authority, but the king rejected that notion, declaring the petition an unconstitutional request to overrule Parliament. The laws in question had been passed by the legislature, and he was merely executing its will. The Privy Council soon issued a proclamation declaring the colonies in open and avowed rebellion and pledging to use utmost endeavors to suppress them. For most Whigs, the king's supposed submission to Parliament was a farce. They believed influence ran in the opposite direction. After all, the Crown invested in elections to secure supporters in the Commons and dispensed lucrative places as patronage. When the king opened Parliament on October 13, 1775, he again insisted that the Americans must be suppressed. Reports from across the Atlantic, he claimed, gave him the strongest hopes of the most decisive good consequences. Richmond rose to object, arguing that the policy of punishing the Americans had merely introduced another cause of war and revolt. The British, as Richmond saw the Americans too, were defined by a spirit of liberty. Attempting to break the spirit of any large part of the British nation should therefore provoke shame and horror. The colonies, he argued, should be preserved as societies of free people, British because they were free, and free because they were British. A shift in policy was required. No legislation had ever described the relationship between the British Empire and the American colonies in positive terms, as one grounded in connection and freedom. But that was precisely what was needed. As he had once sought to clarify Canada's place within the imperial system, Richmond now sought to clarify America's. The Crown's policy, he maintained, should be to regulate, not to destroy. Any victory achieved by stripping subjects of their constitutional liberties opened the door to the same degradations at home. The treatment of the Americans risked establishing precedents the most dangerous to the liberties of this kingdom. Richmond did not yet have a solution to this puzzle. He had, though, brought the problem into sharper focus. Given the structure of British constitutionalism, the war seemed to demand the subjection of the Americans to the authority of Parliament. But the Americans wanted most of all their own legislatures. Preserving constitutional order with the colonies as part of Britain would paradoxically require limiting Parliament's power over the colonies while giving the king a more direct relationship with them. Richmond first fully articulated what was needed in 1779 when addressing the question of Ireland. In the House of Lords on May 11, 1779, the Marquess of Rockingham brought up the poor economic conditions in Ireland and advocated for relief measures to support Irish welfare and unity with England. In the debate that followed, Richmond supported an amendment proposing a closer, fairer Anglo-Irish relationship without legislative union, but with mutual loyalty. He remarked that his noble friend Shelburne had talked of a union. He was for a union, but not a union of legislature, but a union of hearts, hands, of affections, and interests. With Richmond's amendment, the motion passed unanimously. Here, Richmond at last began to install his innovative approach to constitutionalism at the heart of the British government, planting the seeds of what would eventually be the arrangement of the Commonwealth. The British Parliament would legislate for Britain only, while other countries within the Commonwealth would have their own independent legislatures, yet all would be bound by a union of hearts, affections, and interests, not obligations and exchequers to the British Crown. Using the Irish example, Richmond tried to bring his new model of constitutionalism to bear on American policy. In response to Spain's declaration of war on June 17, he once more proposed the withdrawal of British troops from America to focus on defending Britain against the combined threat of France and Spain. The proposal was compatible with the new kind of union he had in mind, and he was supported in it by Lord Shelburne. The proposal once again sparked heated debates, and once again, Parliament was unready to give up its authority over the colonies. The growing pressure of empire was clearly destabilizing the concept of the king and Parliament as the source of law. Richmond even suggested severing that link as far as Britain's colonial possessions were concerned. The idea that the king might be united to many parliaments, with those parliaments being linked in a union of hearts, was Richmond's first fundamental innovation. He was replacing sovereign in Parliament as the source of law with sovereign in multiple parliaments. The summer of 1779 found Richmond very busy supervising his militia in Sussex, preparing for a potential invasion by France and Spain of the south coast. Their combined navies could be seen in the Channel, but British military commanders had decided to concentrate the forces that remained in England inland. Richmond understood the entire defense of his nation to rest on his shoulders. Another problem was also weighing on him: a shift from a theory of sovereign in Parliament to one of sovereign in multiple parliaments as a description of the British Constitution and as the source of all legitimate law solved one problem, but only by creating another. If Parliament gave up control over the colonies, would that not concentrate power in the hands of the king? What would prevent the king from overpowering the two houses of Parliament? So this is a 1780s portrait here on the right of Richmond, this one by Romney of himself in his philosophical mode. And so this is the point about him. He produced his own biography in his portraits. You saw the really gallant young man on grand tour, and then you have the soldier, and then you have the philosopher. And that is himself telling his own story of how he developed. So these are the questions he's pondering. Would not the solution he devised now produce a king who was too powerful? For most Whigs, and certainly for the radicals, even without the kind of change to a sovereign in multiple parliaments that Richmond was envisioning, the king's supposed submission to Parliament was already only notional, even before any kind of change such as this. Influence appeared to run from the crown to Parliament, not the other way around. When John Wilkes, in the 1760s, the radical rabble-rouser and convicted felon, stood for Parliament and won a seat, the government refused to seat him. Nor did the House of Commons stand up for Wilkes or for the right of the people to choose its own representatives, no matter how appalling they might be. Neither did the Lords stand up. Richmond berated his fellow peers not to crouch to the Commons, not to humble yourself before the crown, and not to become as contemptible as the Lords of Charles. He added, "You will lose all authority and cease to have any weight in the scale of government. For what purpose was the legislature divided into separate branches? In order to be a check upon each other." Also, there was the problem of rotten boroughs, constituencies with very small populations that could be controlled through the acquisition of property and that then enabled the control of a set of seats in Parliament. All these facts meant Parliament wasn't functioning as a representative of the full people of the country. Also, there was the problem of patronage. As one scholar has recorded, in 1780, the government payroll contained around 50 government officials, 30 sinecurists, 25 court officials, 65 military and naval officers, 11 contractors, and 11 holders of Secret Service pensions. Between places and investment in elections through rotten boroughs and otherwise, by 1780, the government commanded the loyalty of about 200 of the House of Commons' 558 members. This arithmetic explained why the opposition seldom prevailed in the 1770s. It was consistently outspent. Where there is no viable opposition, where so many members of Parliament were dependent on the Crown for financial remuneration, could Parliament in any way be said to be a separate and independent force from the Crown? The constitutional crisis stemmed, Richmond realized, not just from the king's overreach, nor simply from the problem of empire, but also from a corrupted Parliament. You could not have a government of king and Parliament if the supposedly triadic structure of king, commons, and lords simply collapsed into the king's will because of corruption and dependence in Parliament. The concept of a king in Parliament or a king in multiple parliaments could work only if Parliament were in fact independent from the king. Two remedies were needed. The first was an end to the corruption of the civil list payments. This policy Edmund Burke developed and advanced as economical reform. It would pass in 1782 as the Civil Establishment Act of that year. Richmond supported this, but also worked on a second remedy alongside it, and this is where universal manhood suffrage comes in. Two of his radical associates, James Burke and Major John Cartwright, had already done work on universal manhood suffrage in the early and mid-1770s. Burke, a Scottish Presbyterian dissenter who, like Thomas Paine, worked for Richmond as a pamphleteer, had argued that suffrage should be expanded. He relied on an anti-corruption argument. The larger the electorate, the harder it would be for the king to buy. Major Cartwright, a naval man, went all the way to advocating for full universal manhood suffrage. In contrast to Burke, Cartwright's case rested not on the fight against corruption, but instead on the inalienable natural rights of all men and the need to respect them. In the summer of 1779, facing the French and Spanish navies off the coast, Richmond's constitutional thinking also crystallized. He merged the two lines of argument of his associates, the one that widening suffrage was an antidote to corruption, the other that universal manhood suffrage was the only way to give form to the moral claim of natural rights. We know when Richmond's thinking crystallized from the marginalia in the books he was reading. So this are some pages from the single most annotated volume in his library. This was a volume that collated several remonstrances against the king and the king's responding addresses, beginning with the Wilkes events in the spring of 1770. The exchanges between the king and his subjects addressed British constitutional structure. Richmond read this volume closely and annotated it, as you could see, but not only annotated, wrote in the paragraphs whole sort of arguments of political and philosophical analysis, scrawling in the unprinted portion of nearly every page. These notes have never been published, but I would argue they capture a moment at which a modern conception of representation was born. For instance, Richmond read a remonstrance against the king that observed, "It is the misfortune of your majesty, it is the misfortune and grief of your people to have a ground council and a representative under an undue and dangerous influence." He marked that sentence with an asterisk and then wrote, "This is the real source of all the evils and danger with which the nation is at present afflicted. No remedy, therefore, can be so efficacious as a reformation in that very point. There cannot be a legal government in this kingdom without a due representation of all the people." Only 1 in 75 people had the right to vote, Richmond noted, having clearly read Cartwright, who developed that calculation. Also, not all who held that right exercised it. Parliament had become rather a misrepresentation than a representation of the people. "Every individual," he wrote, "ought to be esteemed in the state what he is in the Christian church, viz., a member of it, because no inheritances of land, houses, etc., are to be esteemed so valuable as that common inheritance in the laws to which everyone is entitled." On the next page, he added, There can be no constitutional authority without the free and uninfluenced assent of the majority of the people. 4 years later, in a public letter communicating his approach to the Constitution, he would write, "It is true that the poorest man in the kingdom will have an equal vote with the first for the choice of the person to whom he trusts his all, and he ought to have that equal degree of security against oppression." In order to make universal manhood suffrage imaginable for all men over 21, regardless of their property holdings, Richmond offered a concrete proposal. The entire country should be divided into equivalently sized electoral districts, each with 1,000 voters. This, he thought, would enable folding all voters in while maintaining the then existing size of Parliament at 558 members. In fact, his population math was inaccurate, and his colleague John Cartwright did better. He suggested that districts would have to hold 2,924 voters. But between them, Cartwright and Richmond invented the concept of equally sized electoral districts that are now a staple of modern democracies. It did take a century for the idea to become a reality. And just to give you a sense, on the left, the historical practice, even in the revolutionary period in the US, was to incorporate towns and municipalities. So towns would send representatives to the joint legislature. But it was only Cartwright and Richmond who conceived of this alternative of what is now like air and water to us, districts of equal-sized populations. They did that, and then it was taken up a century later. You'll hear more in a minute about how the reform movement kept that alive, but it was a really radical invention, and importantly, a technological invention. It drove, of course, then the need for the census, the need for mapping, et cetera, in order to create what we now take for granted as the modern structure of districted-based representation. So with that idea, equal electoral districts, populations being equally allocated, Richmond arrived at a reconceptualization of the foundations of the British political system. The surest way to secure Parliament's independence from the king was to extend the franchise, both because as a matter of natural rights, every man was due the suffrage, also because if every man could vote on behalf of his family, and if each MP owed his seat to a broad constituency, MPs could no longer be bought. Prompted by the American Revolution, Richmond gained insight on how executive power could be restrained. The broader the electorate and the more competitive the elections, the less likely corruption and authoritarianism are to take hold. Popular sovereignty would make it possible to bind a monarch to multiple legislatures across the realm without weakening those legislatures. Universal manhood suffrage offered a way to preserve British liberty at home amid imperial expansion. Paradoxically, it was empire that made universal suffrage first seem necessary. Having reached this conclusion, Richmond introduced his bill in the House of Lords on June 3, 1780, for universal manhood suffrage. At the very same time as he introduced his bill, 14,000 angry protesters protesting toleration of Catholics stormed Parliament. Needless to say, a crowd of that size, roughing up members of Parliament, killed Richmond's bill. So the end of his specific effort emerged on the same day that he introduced the bill. But what was important about his effort is the conceptual foundations that he laid. He offered a new account of what institutional forms were needed to make the sovereign and Parliament a meaningful source of law compatible with traditional British liberties in a new imperial condition. And as he wrote, there can be no constitutional authority without the free and uninfluenced assent of the majority of the people. The sovereign and Parliament could be stabilized as a source of law for the growing empire only if the arrangement rested on moral foundations justifying universal manhood suffrage. The source of law was not the king or the members of Parliament, nor the simple combination of those two official roles, but the people. The people made the sovereign and Parliament the source of constitutional authority through their assent. The sovereign and Parliament should be better understood under Richmond's formulation as the sovereign and Parliament, the people willing. Richmond had a timely opportunity to explain his thinking about reform late in the summer of 1783. Now, this is an image of him from that year, just after he's taken a role of Master General of the Ordnance in the cabinet. So he's in his official Master General regalia. After an unseasonably hot summer in Paris, made hazy by a volcano erupting in Iceland, he found a letter waiting for him at home from Colonel William Sharman, chair of the combined local militias in Ireland. Colonel Sharman had written to 6 leading reformers, including Richmond and Cartwright. The colonel posed 8 questions about parliamentary reform. Richmond's response was the one best suited for standalone publication and became the standard treatise on reform, reprinted until 1859. Richmond took the opportunity to offer an important clarification of his position. The argument that Parliament should not have sovereignty over the colonies, but only the Crown should do so, seemed to increase the power of the king. This put the constitutional system out of balance by overweighting the monarch. Richmond solved that problem by introducing the idea of universal manhood suffrage. But then that idea seemed itself a measure that would increase the power of Parliament and put the system out of balance by overweighting the people's voice. The idea that the sovereign and Parliament should be better understood as the sovereign and Parliament, the people willing, was radical. Richmond found himself accused of being a leveler or a Republican. Initially, he considered these charges unimportant. During the 1770s, as the fate of America still hung in the balance, would the Americans end up underneath the sovereign authority of the Crown, or would they be independent? When those questions were still live, the radical community could pursue their ideas of parliamentary reform without having to face the question of whether they were choosing republicanism or not. The Battle of Yorktown in 1781 and the victory of the Americans in that war changed the context. Now, in 1783, when Richmond gets this request from Colonel Sharman, an actual republic has come into existence. It had emerged out of the very same views and voices that were urging reform in England. Was the turn to universal manhood suffrage also necessarily an argument for republicanism? That question and its answer had to be clarified. Richmond's former protege, Thomas Paine, had already answered emphatically yes, in common sense. Republicanism was the only answer once you were committed to the rights of man and fighting corruption. Now, Richmond, in his own answer, letter to Colonel Sharman, was equally emphatic that universal manhood suffrage did not require republicanism. Instead, he argued, I am not for a democratic any more than an aristocratic or monarchic government solely. I am for that admirable mixture of the three that our inimitable and comprehensive Constitution has established. The early Montesquieu of his early learning flows through in his answer. But Richmond did more than argue for a mixed constitution, for constitutional monarchy welded to popular sovereignty. As he prepared to bring his motion for universal manhood suffrage forward in 1779 and 1780, Richmond also engaged extensively in grassroots organizing. This practice had been on the rise since the late 1760s, and Richmond went out of his way to try to unite 3 factions of grassroots activists into a united movement for parliamentary reform. There were county reformers, such as his own voters in Sussex. There were city radicals, who committed faster than anyone else to universal manhood suffrage. And there were the Whig magnates, who oscillated between focusing exclusively on economical reform and on the wider parliamentary reform program. By seeking to drive reform by calling the people into the process, Richmond was in fact working to make popular sovereignty not only a theory, but a reality. He was showing people what would be concretely required for a legal system where law emanated not just from the king and parliament, but more specifically from the king and parliament, the people willing. Politicians would have to campaign widely. After the Battle of Yorktown, the British government cycled through a series of brief ministries and repeated crises. During that period, Richmond looked for opportunities to install the program of constitutional reform within a governing administration. He reconciled with the king and accepted that appointment as Master of the Ordnance. He tried first to get the Marquess of Rockingham to embed his reform program in government policy, but Rockingham died mere months into his role as prime minister. Richmond then abandoned his own party and joined Shelburne's ministry, hoping to get him to take up the reform agenda. Shelburne was, though, too politically weak to move anything forward. Then, in a period of crisis, with one more government having intervened, Richmond and King George III hit on the same solution for their separate difficulties: the 24-year-old William Pitt the Younger. And I always have to pause and say, 24 years old? Prime Minister? My God. The king needed a stable government. Richmond needed a political leader with broad authority committed to reform. Both had the potential for what they wanted in Pitt. Pitt had been working with Richmond on reform for several years already. He also had deep respect for the monarchy. The king made Pitt prime minister, and Richmond joined his ministry, helping the very green prime minister stabilize a government from which many were resigning. The king understood that the British nation was in a perilous state and undertook desperate measures to steady it. Pitt faced a daunting prospect. When his appointment was announced, 16 peers and 32 commoners resigned from government offices on the spot. Or as the London Chronicle put it, everybody resigned, even those to whom the text of the poet may be applied, that to resign's the last mad thing they do. If Pitt's government were to succeed, the young prime minister needed the ballast of experience in his government. Richmond agreed to join Pitt's cabinet and to resume his role as Master General of the Ordnance. By shoring up Pitt's ministry with needed legitimacy, Richmond gave the king the stable government he craved, placed at last in the hands of a man George could both respect and trust. Pitt quickly called snap elections to try to strengthen his hand, and here is where Richmond's extra-parliamentary organizing came into play. He was able to hand off to Pitt the extensive grassroots network he had built, and Pitt campaigned in a way that would now be consonant with modern political experience. After the election, Pitt, Richmond wrote, had the fullest support of the people from all quarters. With that support, the prime minister would be able to carry the measures to which he is pledged, Richmond added, very much having parliamentary reform in mind. He also confided that Pitt was someone very well disposed to keep his word. In this letter, Richmond was reporting on the strengthening of modern popular party politics. In Pitt's person, Richmond was already winning the cause of parliamentary reform, restoring the independence of Parliament from the Crown through the power of the people. With Pitt's elevation to the premiership, a nation long managed exclusively in the private dining rooms of aristocrats passed into the age of popular politics, where would-be prime ministers campaign with the people broadly. Richmond's choice for monarchy over republicanism, coupled with his perseverance in drumming up popular support for widening the franchise, peaceably birthed a future for popular sovereignty in Britain. He made it possible for Pitt to weld monarchy and popular politics together. George III declared that there was no man in his dominions by whom he had been so much offended, and no man to whom he was so much indebted as the Duke of Richmond. The king was indeed indebted to Richmond because the monarch and the monarchy survived in an age when other monarchs fell. The concept of the sovereign in Parliament as the source of law in Britain endured through the age of revolutions, but only by becoming the sovereign in Parliament, the people willing. The concept endured because of a fundamental reconceptualization, a reconceptualization that had both a moral basis and a practical organizational form to make that moral foundation real. Richmond's ideas finally came to full fruition only in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Richmond himself put down the baton of reform in the early 1790s. A new generation of reformers in the House of Commons, including the future Prime Minister and future Earl, Charles Grey, revived reform motions in Parliament, hoping to fend off the bloody descent of France. Like the early reformers in the 1770s and Pitt in the 1780s, Grey settled into a pattern starting in 1790 of annually introducing the same bill, drafted in the mold of Richmond's original proposals. He would reintroduce his motion for decades until, in a surprising turn of events, he became prime minister in 1830, and 2 years later won passage of the Reform Act, the greatest change in England's political institutions excuse me, since the Protectorate of Cromwell in the 17th century. This act broadened suffrage and redistributed seats from rotten boroughs to the new industrial centers, finally accomplishing at least one of the Duke's reforms proposed generations earlier. Grey's government also won passage of the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, ending enslavement in the British Empire. As I showed you, the idea of equal districts was introduced alongside the Third Reform Act of 1884 via the Redistribution of Seats Act in 1885. Universal manhood suffrage was fully achieved only in 1918, universal female suffrage in 1928. In 1931, the Statute of Westminster defined the relationship between Britain and the self-governing dominions of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the Irish Free State, and Newfoundland as one of autonomous communities within the British Empire, equal in status, in no way subordinate one to another in any aspect of their domestic or external affairs, though united by a common allegiance to the Crown and freely associated as members of the British Commonwealth of Nations. Each of these reforms gave concrete institutional shape to the conceptual innovations that Richmond had put on the table in the 1770s and 1780s. When Hart, in 1961, took up the idea of Queen in Parliament as the stable source of law, he drew on legal theorists of the late 19th century who had recorded the concept in its modernized and stabilized version, with popular sovereignty welded to it. The meaning of the concept and the organizational form attending on it had not passed unchanged from the Glorious Revolution to the Victorian Age. Instead, the concept had been much revised under the pressures of the Age of Revolution and Imperial expansion to yield the basis of modern constitutional monarchy. A blueprint for the modernized concept and modernized constitutional monarchy was first comprehensively laid down by the third Duke of Richmond, even if it took many others to pick up and refine the blueprint and eventually deliver the constitutional monarchy we know today. The story of how Richmond stabilized the King in Parliament concept also introduces new evidence to the jurisprudential debate between H.L.A. Hart and his successor, Ronald Dworkin. Hart famously held that the existence of a legal system depends on that rule of recognition, that convergent practice among officials about what counts as a source of law. In his argument that convergence is at bottom a social fact that needs no moral foundation. Dworkin replied that no such bare social fact could do the work Hart asked of it, that what makes officials' convergent practice the practice it is depends on the moral political theory that animates it. Strip away the moral theory and you don't have a thinner rule of recognition, you have no determinate rule at all. I think Richmond's intervention vindicates Dworkin, so with apologies to the Hart family. The doctrine that the King and Parliament is the source of law had been in crisis throughout the 1770s, strained by the American claim that representation was a precondition of legislative authority, by domestic agitation over corruption and the franchise, and by the Irish question. Richmond didn't stabilize this doctrine by merely reasserting it. He stabilized it by giving it a moral foundation, popular sovereignty channeled through equal representation under a constitutional monarch, and then also by proposing the concrete institutional reforms, universal manhood suffrage, equal electoral districts, and annual parliaments, not ever realized, that would make British practice answer to that foundation. The doctrine that ultimately emerged, alongside the reforms themselves, was not the bare social fact of officials pointing to Westminster. It was a normatively grounded commitment to a particular kind of representative legitimacy, which officials and citizens converged on because the moral case for it had been made. I think Hart's framework can't quite accommodate this move. The rule of recognition that Hart treated as a paradigm of a brute social fact was made into the kind of rule it became by moral argument and institutional design. Without Richmond's fusion of theory with reform and the work of those who similarly followed him in this effort, there is no reason to think officials would have converged on the doctrine as we know it, and good reason to think that they would not have, judging from the revolutions that transpired in the era. The moral foundations did not supplement the source of law from outside, they defined what the source of law was. Thank you.